Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center and another installment of our virtual versions of America's Town Hall. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, and it has now become a virtual ritual that we begin these programs by reciting together the inspiring mission from Congress of the National Constitution Center. Our great guests have not heard us do it together before, so behind our screens, I know we're all gathering together and reminding ourselves that the National Constitution Center is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis in order to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. And it feels especially satisfying to recite that wonderful mantra tonight, because we are launching a great partnership with another meaningful and important nonpartisan American institution, and that is the National Association of Attorneys General. The National Association of Attorneys General brings together the elected and appointed attorneys general across the country, Republican and Democratic, to discuss common legal issues arising in their states. And their nonpartisan mission is so aligned with ours that we've decided to launch this program as the first of what we have no doubt will be a great series. It's presented in partnership with the Center for Excellence in Governance at the National Association of Attorneys General, and I'm especially grateful to Mike Kuykendall, who's the director of the National Association of Attorneys General Center for Excellence in Government, and the rest of his wonderful team. Our guests tonight are, as they've been wonderfully tweeting, from different states and different political parties, but united by their shared commitment to the rule of law and their enthusiasm for this conversation, which I completely share. Our first guest is Attorney General Tim Fox. General Fox is the Attorney General of Montana, and he is the president of the National Association of Attorneys General. And I'm so grateful to him for his leadership in encouraging this partnership and in agreeing to be one of the first guests on our joint programs. He served as a law clerk to Associate Justice Gurbir of the Montana Supreme Court. He has served in private practice, and he has also been a law clerk to Justice Gurbir before practicing law, and is, as I say, currently serving as the president of the National Association of Attorneys General. And he is joined tonight by Attorney General Grewal. He is the Attorney General for the state of New Jersey. Before that, he was the chief law enforcement officer in Bergen County. He worked as an assistant U.S. attorney in the criminal division of the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New York, and he has also worked in private practice. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome Generals Fox and Grewal.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's so great to see you both. You look wonderful in your respective settings, and I'm excited to discuss with you the many legal issues that you are dealing with in your states that have arisen out of the COVID crisis. We have many to discuss, and I'd like to begin with the effect of COVID on the criminal justice system, because there have been several lawsuits against federal and state departments of prisons arguing that prisoners should be released because of the COVID crisis. And in particular, General Grewal, there's been some cases that have led to some decisions arising out of New Jersey. There was a suit against immigrations that have been held in detention, arguing that they're being unfairly endangered because although they haven't been convicted of anything, they're being detained in unsafe conditions. And some preliminary orders for this lawsuit, which has been filed by the ACLU, has led to the order of the release of some detainees. What can you tell us? And I know both of you are constrained to some degree about what you're able to say about pending cases. What can you tell us, General Grewal, about the lawsuits in New Jersey against the immigration department detainees, what the legal arguments are? Give us a sense of the legal arguments on both sides and how those lawsuits are faring.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me this evening. It really is an honor and a privilege to join you and General Fox for this discussion. And as I mentioned earlier, I look forward to doing this live in Philadelphia, hopefully in the near future. The two lawsuits that you referenced, and I think there might be several others, involve the ACLU and others challenging the Department of Justice, challenging ICE over civil immigration detainees who are being held in some of our county jails across New Jersey. And there are due process claims being made that the confinement of these detainees is excessive punishment, and some of them have been successful. And Judge Arleo, district court judge, recently ordered a number of federal immigration detainees released. But what's interesting is that we as a state were in a similar position in early March. And as we began to prepare for the coming onslaught of this virus, it became apparent to me and others in my department that this virus was going to hit prisons in a unique way, that people in county jails and in prisons don't have the luxury or ability to socially distance. They don't have access to the same types of sanitary tools that we have, hand sanitizer, other things, face masking, not so readily available. And so early on, when the public defender in our state, along with the ACLU, went to our Chief Justice of our state Supreme Court and asked for an order to show cause as to why certain low-level jailed offenders shouldn't be released because of COVID-19, we did not fight that. As a state, we decided that we could work together because public health and public safety demanded it in that moment, work together under the auspices of our Supreme Court with the public defender, with the ACLU, and identify low-level offenders in county jails who could be released, and they could be brought back to serve their sentences later. So in that process, in a matter of a week, we identified 800 people who could be released. Our county prosecutors, my office included, challenged a number of those releases based on safety grounds, and ultimately 700 folks were released, and they were ordered to come back to complete their sentences, county jail sentences of 1 year or less, after this pandemic is over. And we thought that was the right thing to do, so we're happy to see that the federal courts are doing the same thing, albeit under pressure of litigation, that the federal authorities, rather, are doing the same thing under the pressure of litigation. But that's something we did voluntarily, and our Department of Corrections is engaging in something similar also very proactively, because as a state, we are just absolutely crushed by COVID-19. We have lost over 8,000 wonderful souls in this state to this pandemic. And so we're going to do everything possible to prevent deaths in custodial settings where once this spreads, it can go like wildfire.
Thank you for that meaningful example of working together with state correction officials to come up with a solution like that. Thank you for reminding our audience of the difference between the state and the federal court system and the distinction between that federal suit, which is arising out of the immigration authorities, and condolences to the state of New Jersey, which, as you said, is now experiencing the highest toll of any state. Our thoughts are with all of you. General Fox, you too are experiencing important decisions about the treatment of prisoners. There is a lawsuit arising in the Supreme Court of Montana. There was an order just a few weeks ago in April involving a request that the court reduce the population of Montana's jails, prisons, and houses of correction because Montana is under a state of emergency due to COVID. Tell us about that lawsuit and other things that you and your office are doing regarding COVID and criminal justice.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for the question. And it is a great honor to be on this town hall with you and General Grewal, who I count as a personal friend. A little background real quick. As you mentioned, I'm the president of the National Association of Attorneys General, and my presidential initiative this year is statesmanship and civility in the office of the 56 Attorneys General, state, territorial, and District of Columbia. And the great work that our association with the unfortunate acronym NAG does, I think, is pretty historical. And so I count it as a real honor to work with individuals like General Grewal and the other attorneys general And General Grewal, I believe, and he could correct me if I'm wrong, is an appointed Attorney General by the governor and confirmed by the Senate of New Jersey. In Montana, the Attorney General under our Constitution is elected, as is the governor. And so we have a unique situation in Montana where we have a Republican Attorney General and a governor who's a Democrat who used to be the Attorney General before me. And you're right. We got a lawsuit filed in the Montana Supreme Court by Disability Rights Montana, represented by the ACLU, arguing that the court should exercise jurisdiction and order that the Department of Corrections for the state prison, as well as all of the county jails in our state, of which there are about 56, be ordered to release certain non-violent individuals who may have disabilities or compromised immune systems. And ultimately, what we did, we had 5 days to respond to that lawsuit. And so I represented the governor's Department of Corrections, my office did. And we were able to show the proactive steps that, in fact, all the jails and the Department of Corrections had taken to prevent this pandemic from spreading. And of course, very close quarters, in many respects, an inability to social distance. But all of the county jails and our men's prison and women's prison in Montana had been very proactive, and the governor of Montana had made sure that that happened. And we were able to do, at just 5 short days, provide dozens of affidavits attesting to all of the work that had been done to make sure that our prisons and jails are safe for the inmates. Of course, this was an Eighth Amendment argument, cruel and unusual punishment under which they brought this suit. The Supreme Court, in a unanimous 7-0 decision, denied the application for supervisory control. But we are still continuing to be vigilant in Montana, make sure we take steps to protect all Montanans, including those who are in our correctional systems.
Thank you for all that. General Grewal, another beat on this crucial question of COVID and criminal justice. General Fox just mentioned an Eighth Amendment suit. Have you had any in New Jersey, or do you anticipate any claims that the detention of inmates represents cruel and unusual punishment? Are there any other constitutional claims that you're facing? We just did a very interesting We the People podcast on the Constitution and criminal justice and learned that some detainees are filing Sixth Amendment suits alleging that their rights to speedy trial are being violated during the time when courts are operating virtually. And more broadly, give us a sense of what the major legal and constitutional issues you see unfolding in New Jersey involving criminal justice and COVID over the coming months.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Jeff. We have not seen those challenges in the state. And I think that's in large part due to the collaborative arrangement that we arrived at with our Supreme Court, with our Office of Public Defender, with the ACLU. And I think the reality really in this state, which is particularly hard hit as compared to some countries and certainly other states, is much different than what it likely is in Montana. We're also the most densely populated state in the country, with over 9 million people packed into a fairly small state geographically. And so the reality of the spread, the reality of the danger in our jails, even though they've taken all those steps that the general mentioned, is, I think, a little bit unique. And we're seeing that the spread, how it happens at Rikers across the river. We saw what happened in Illinois. So we've been working proactively. And I think dropping the population in our county jails by 700 was a first step. And so we haven't seen challenges in our county jails. We went on to work with our Department of Corrections. Our governor issued an executive order to create a framework to identify medically frail or immunocompromised state prisoners who are near the end of their sentence or have been previously denied parole. And so we've come up with the lists where we, as prosecutors, my role is, I am appointed, as the general said, but I do have a unique role from most state AGs, because not only am I the chief legal officer for my state, providing advice to all the agencies of state, I'm also the chief law enforcement officer. So I oversee all law enforcement operations and all 21 of our county prosecutors and set law enforcement policy. I also oversee our state OEM. So the FEMA type response happening at the state level, that comes through us. And then I also have the traditional consumer protection role. So because of that, we have a lot of different tools at our disposal to be fighting this crisis, and we see it from so many different places. So, from the law enforcement role, we also have to be mindful of objecting to those prisoners that we don't think should be released from our correctional system. So we have that process, and it's underway. And so we haven't had the court challenges. Juvenile Justice, that's a commission that's within my office. So I oversee the Juvenile Justice Commission in my role as AG. We've done a remarkable job over the last 10 years dropping the incarcerated population of young people in our state from about 1,200 a decade ago to about 200. So we have the most serious young people who are incarcerated right now. But we know that these are young people in our charge, and we owe them a special duty of care right now in this pandemic to make sure we're doing absolutely everything possible. And so we're doing all the steps of distancing and mitigation, but even there, we're working collaboratively with the public defender and others and the Rutgers Law Clinic to figure out, are there young people here who we could get back home to their families? Is there somewhere more safe for them than in a correctional setting? Again, understanding how quickly the spread goes. So I think because of that collaborative relationship and process that we've put in place where we can object to the most dangerous, we've largely not seen those court challenges. Other legal issues, though, you mentioned the Sixth Amendment. Again, here too, we're working collaboratively. Our state Supreme Court, our Chief Justice, who was a former Attorney General, so maybe that's why the collaborative relationship persists, convened a working group to see how we could do virtual grand juries. Because if not for this pandemic, perhaps for the second wave, we might be in a situation where we have people sitting in county jails waiting to be indicted and their Sixth Amendment rights impacted. None of us ever thought we would even have this discussion, but the reality that we're seeing on the ground in my state is requiring us to take these types of positions, because I think leadership demands that right now, to make tough decisions. I don't like the idea of a grand juror sitting in their living room with an iPad weighing in on a vote, not knowing who's behind them or how we're maintaining the secrecy. But is there a discussion to be had there so we can avoid those Sixth Amendment challenges? Not just for the rights of the defendant there, too. We have to keep in mind the rights of the victims in those cases to bring a defendant to justice more quickly. So these are discussions we're having. And I think we're so fortunate in this state that we have great leaders on our Supreme Court and in all these different stakeholders. And we've had this tradition of collaboration over the last 3 years as Attorney General. And having those relationships of trust, I think, are avoiding the contested issues and allowing us to negotiate resolutions and a path forward in this pandemic.
Thank you very much for that really helpful survey of the many issues that may arise and also the collaborative things that New Jersey is doing. That notion of virtual grand juries is fascinating. As you say, it could raise constitutional questions. The late Justice Scalia's opinion in the Crawford case said that the Confrontation Clause gave the accused the right to confront their accusers, and you can imagine similar issues as more things go virtual. General Fox, the same question to you. I first of all, thank you for your initiative to promote civility on behalf of the National Associations for Attorneys General. Give us a sense of how you imagine issues involving criminal justice and the Constitution unfolding in Montana over the next couple months. Is this a partisan issue, or is it something where both parties are gathering together to join? And then I'll just put into the mix a couple of questions we're getting from our great audience. Roberto Alvarez asked, what constitutes a low-level offender? And Sunita Sohrabji asked, what are the number of deaths in infections in county and state jails?
Sure. So, Montana, we often say in the last couple of months, or at least I have, that we've been social distancing since statehood in 1889. We're the fourth largest state geographically. We only have 1 million people. We have 56 county jurisdictions, and I believe about 22 of those have not experienced a COVID-19 case. We've had 457 confirmed cases of the virus. 400 of those have recovered fully, and we've had, unfortunately, 16 deaths, and a number of those were in a retirement home setting, unfortunately. So, we call ourselves the big sky country, the treasure state, and many other things, but sometimes being a rural state has its advantages, but our heart goes out to our friends in New Jersey and New York and every other, actually all around the world, for the strife and just pure problem that this has given rise to. So we've not had any deaths in our criminal justice system from the COVID-19 virus. We've had, I believe, one confirmed case of an inmate in a county jail who was later obviously removed and hospitalized so that he could recover. So again, the steps that were taken early on were very, very important, and we have not seen any other instances of lawsuits concerning our criminal justice system. We have, though, had a lot of other things that our office has been involved in. We have the Consumer Protection Office in Montana as well, and so we have worked very hard on trying to prevent scams and fraud related to the virus. Another issue that came up was we have a citizen initiative process that's very robust in Montana, and there are organizations trying to get recreational marijuana approved in our state, and they were out wanting to get signatures to get their initiative on the ballot. But of course, during the virus situation, that was not possible. So they sued, saying their rights were violated and asking the courts to force the state to put together a virtual process so that signatures could be gathered with a program called DocuSign. That case actually was dismissed. We argued it was a separation of powers issue, that the courts could not really amend the law. The process was what it was. I suspect that the legislature will have to take that up. Another issue, and again, I'm getting off of the criminal justice system, but it's, I guess, Montana-esque, if you will. We have huge cattle producers in our state. And what we've seen is that our food distribution system is starting to crack, particularly with meat processors. There are 4 large multinational meat processors that have 80% of the beef processing market in the United States, and it's essentially a monopoly. So I've been working with the U.S. Department of Justice, and in fact have spoken directly with Attorney General William Barr and his chief antitrust lawyer, Macon Delrim, about this issue. And today, 9 state attorneys general sent a letter to Attorney General Barr asking the U.S. Department of Justice to initiate an investigation into alleged price fixing and monopolistic activities within the market. What we've seen is that the prices for cattle futures are at an 18-year low, but the prices for box meat that you're paying for in the retail grocery stores has gone up. So that's the Montana-type issues that we're seeing that have affected our office and kept us very, very busy.
Fascinating. Thank you for all that. We've all been reading about the national meat shortages, and it is very helpful to know about your efforts to challenge price fixing wherever it occurs. General Grewal, there's been a bunch of questions about conflicts between quarantine orders for non-essential businesses and constitutional rights. General Barr, who General Fox just mentioned, said that in cases where if a state or local ordinance crosses the line from an appropriate exercise of authority to stop the spread of COVID into an overbearing infringement of constitutional and statutory protections, the Department of Justice may have an obligation to address that overreach in federal court. Quite a strong statement in his memo to U.S. attorneys called Balancing Public Safety with the Preservation of Civil Rights. At the state level, in New Jersey, you have faced a lawsuit involving a New Jersey gun shop, which argues that Governor Murphy's order shutting down businesses to contain COVID violates the Second Amendment right to bear arms. And the claim is that the executive order should have exclaimed firearms dealers from its list of non-essential businesses. And in Virginia, a judge ordered basically said that the federal and state right to bear arms does outweigh emergency authority held by Governor Northam, and said that a Virginia gun range has to be allowed to open to customers despite a statewide executive order. So tell us what you can about the status of that New Jersey case, and more broadly about the conflict in New Jersey between the quarantine order and the right to bear arms.
Thanks, Jeff. Just for a second, I'll just touch on the two viewers' question or listeners' questions, if you don't mind. On low-level offenders, when we were talking about the county jail release here in New Jersey, those are folks in our county jails who are serving sentences of 364 days or less. We don't have felonies. We call them indictables here. And these are usually not indictables. These are usually disorderly persons type offenses, low-level offenses, or violations of probation. And even then, we had a process in place to object to the most serious of those offenders. There was also a question about the number of deaths in our custodial setting. This is something that we've all been very transparent about. So if you go to the various websites for our Juvenile Justice Commission, you'll see the number of young people that have been tested and how many have tested positive. Thankfully, none have died as a result of this virus. But I did institute something which I believe was first of its kind initiative, which was to have universal testing of the population in our Juvenile Justice Commission. And so I think we have about 20 plus out of 200 that tested positive, and we're quarantining and addressing their medical needs appropriately. In our correctional system, which is not our county jails, but our prisons, I think we've had close to, again, this is all public, about 40 inmates who died as a result of COVID-19. And again, as a state, we've lost over 8,000, in fact, over 300 reported deaths today. So this is a very real issue. It's an issue that we've been very transparent about. We're going to universal testing in our Department of Corrections, including for the staff, and I think that's going to be on a repeating basis moving forward to make sure we're addressing these issues. So on the gun store issue, this is perhaps the quickest out I'll ever have from a Second Amendment argument, although there are a couple of cases pending before the Supreme Court, which they're deciding whether or not to grant cert on Rogers versus Grewal. This particular case, when the governor established his list of businesses that were essential and non-essential, the gun stores were put in the category of non-essential. And that largely was based on federal guidance from the Department of Homeland Security that they had issued and listed them as non-essential businesses. So we based our decision on that guidance. Because of pressure, I suppose, they reversed their decision. And once they reversed their decision, we changed our local order accordingly to say, okay, they're in the essential category. We're going to be in line with the federal guidance from the DHS. But even then, we want to have reasonable restrictions as to the number of people's other conditions that they have to abide by, again, because we don't want those large gatherings of folks in a store. We want to make sure that we're containing and doing everything possible to slow the spread. And so the gun stores are back open with a few restrictions. Those cases against me and the governor have been mooted. And so they're on hold. And so, you know, it's not the executive orders, the stay-at-home orders, the orders declaring essential and non-essential businesses were, in my mind, even before our change, we're not violating Second Amendment rights. We were not interfering with people's rights to own firearms. These were temporary measures where we're trying to balance public health and public safety on the one hand, and individual rights on the other. And you know, as my role as the state's chief legal officer, I have to make tough decisions on guiding our agency of state and our governor in striking that balance. And in all other areas, I think we've found that balance. And even there, we had that balance based on federal guidance. And when that guidance changed, we changed accordingly. And so that issue has been mooted. But you know, others continue to present in other contexts.
That's great. Thank you for that succinct and helpful answer. I need to ask, though, what is Rogers versus Grewal, the case that the Supreme Court is considering?
It's a challenge to our our carry laws, and so that's teed up, and they're going to make their cert decision very soon.
Wow. Well, of course, the New York Second Amendment case just mooted out. So if you were the next one, then we will be eager to come back and talk to you about that very important case. General Fox, any Second Amendment cases in Montana involving the rights of gun stores versus the quarantine orders? And more broadly, how do you or how should courts balance these competing interests and rights?
Sure. So those are some interesting cases in other jurisdictions, and we did have an order that did cover, interestingly enough, and closed pretty much every retail store. But our governor declared that liquor stores were essential services in Montana, so our liquor stores remain open. But we just went to a phased approach of reopening in Montana just because we've had so few cases and so few deaths that we now, as of today, have opened restaurants and bars with social distancing and other retail stores as well. So we're on our way, hopefully, to doing the right things to make sure we don't get another wave. And, it's interesting that we have had a number of folks complain, obviously, about, not being able to buy a gun. A number of our county sheriffs who issue our concealed carry permits, just out of the fact they didn't have the ability to social distance in their offices, temporarily shut that down, and there were a number of folks that were upset about that. But in Montana, you can go to any county sheriff and get your concealed carry permit and do a background check. So we really haven't seen too many hiccups there. We have had a lot of pastors and priests who have questioned the shutdown orders that prohibited them from having church services. Interestingly, my wife and I have been able now to participate in Mass. We're Catholic in churches all over the country, which is kind of interesting. But we understand that those situations can flare up as well. And I know in other jurisdictions there's actually been lawsuits over closure orders that have prohibited folks from actually congregating in churches. Or even further than that, I think in one state, there was a prohibition against even parking in the parking lot and listening to your church service over the loudspeaker. So by and large, we've worked out a number of the kinks in Montana. I think what we'll see everywhere, both on a jurisdictional basis and on a national basis, is a big debrief after we get through all of this and figuring out what we've done right, what we've done wrong, and whether there is, some sort of action in legislation or otherwise to be better at addressing something like this.
Thanks for that. Thanks for mentioning that really interesting case involving drive-in church services. It was a Sixth Circuit case arising from Kentucky, and the Federal Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit temporarily blocked the Kentucky governor's limit on drive-in church services, concluding that it likely violated the Kentucky Religious Freedom Restoration Act and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, mostly because it had a lot of exceptions for plenty of services that were allowed, but not for these drive-in services. General Grewal, any cases involving alleged claims of violations of religious liberty in New Jersey?
We have at least one pending case right now from a church in one of our northern counties that wants to hold in-person services. And so that's in federal court right now, and there's a briefing schedule that's been set. Our briefing's not due till the end of the month. But we're confident, and I had a chance to read the case that you're referring to from the Sixth Circuit, but I think the difference in our state is that we've really been consistent on this. We have a very neutral, generally applicable rule here that prohibits gatherings, period. And so I think that is our strongest argument, that if you're going to have a gathering, it's prohibited. We do allow people to travel for religious purposes, and our orders and administrative orders say groupings of 10 or less are not considered gatherings. And so we're not going to enforce on those, but across the board, anything 10 or more is a violation of the governor's executive order. But at the same time, like I said, we've recognized that people need to be able to travel for religious reasons or for political reasons. So if somebody wants to go visit their pastor and wants to go consult with their pastor or go pray with a priest in a group of 10 or less, well, that's okay. The same way where other gatherings across the state, 10 or less are okay. So I think it's that consistency that is going to allow us to prevail on these challenges. And none of this, again, because they're all generally applicable, is focused on religious practice. And I think that's important to remember here. And we look forward to the challenge that's currently pending, and I don't think it's going to be an issue.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks for noting that the fewer exceptions ban on public gatherings has, the less likely it is to be constitutional vulnerable. I'm personally relieved to hear that the gathering ban is for 10 or less people, because in the Jewish faith, a minyan requires 10 people. That's how many people you need to gather together for liturgical purposes. So my fellow Jews are okay. But it's a very serious question about how people are going to be able to worship under these circumstances. General Fox, it's a question that people around the country are very seriously concerned about. Looking to the next couple of months, do you anticipate more of these religious liberty issues arising? And is this even the kind of issue that General Barr might have been talking about when he talked about the Department of Justice intervening to protect constitutional rights against quarantine orders?
Sure. I hearken back. I grew up in a small town in eastern Montana, Hardin, which was an agricultural community, farmers and ranchers for the most part. And during World War II, in the Bighorn River Valley, the Bighorn River runs into the the Yellowstone River, which runs into the Missouri and then ultimately into the Mississippi, as you know. But in the Bighorn River Valley, a very fertile valley, we had a number of Japanese family farmers during World War II who were rooted up and sent to internment camps in places like California. It's a kind of a blemish on the history of our country, as we know that was extremely unfair, and we know that the Japanese Americans were extremely loyal to our country. But I throw that up as an example of the extreme things that can happen in a crisis, in a national crisis, and we are in a national crisis. Fortunately, we haven't seen, that level of discrimination in violation of our Constitution like we saw in World War II. But I think, as a nation and certainly in the individual states, we are just trying to make that balance to understand how do we, as General Grewal mentioned, how do we promote public health and safety, but yet not violate the rights of our citizens. And frankly, that's something that happens every day, not just in the context of a pandemic. And our nation often gets it right, and oftentimes we get it wrong. And so I feel blessed that we have a constitution, not only of our country, but our individual states. I feel blessed that we have the separation of powers, and we have the three categories of our government, because we can work these things out if we work together. And I appreciate General Grewal's comments about coming together and negotiating and working things out. That is the way that Americans should do it, certainly how Montanans want to do it. And again, we're going to learn a lot of lessons throughout this. We already have. And we're going to have to be better as a country, and certainly as a state of Montana, and probably as the world as well, in how we approach these things in the future. And I think as a general foundational principle, and this isn't legal, it is, let's work together. Let's not point fingers. Let's not get involved in the blame game. Let's act with civility, and let's look for the common ground, the things that bring us together, that can help us to get through a crisis like this.
Jeff, can I jump in real?
Please do. I just wanted to express appreciation for that moving call to unite around the Constitution, which is absolutely right. But please do jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think General Fox is just so 100% right about the spirit of working together. With respect to the free exercise and to religious services, we have such a close relationship with our religious leaders in this state that has been formed over the last 2.5 years. And even probably before that, we have what we call an Interfaith Advisory Council housed in our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, because we typically get together to talk about how do we harden our houses of worship from external threats, like the lone wolf gunman or some sort of terrorist attack. And it's interesting, as this crisis began to unfold, we began to talk about, well, how do we come together and protect ourselves from this new external threat, which is a virus? Much like those other attackers, we can't see this one coming either. And so as we were formulating these executive orders and implementing these policies, our best allies in this state have been our religious leaders, that network of 3,000 or so that are part of our Interfaith Advisory Council in the state, a council that we mobilize when there are incidents of bias against a mosque or against a synagogue or any other house of worship. And it's such a robust group. And to a leader, they have supported our efforts. And so what's interesting to me is that the challenges to our rules, to the executive orders that are banning all gatherings, are not coming from mostly internal actors. They're coming from external actors from out of state, organizations that have perhaps a different agenda. The folks who we work with and have that relationship of trust, who understand that we are the ones who fight for their religious liberties, we are the first ones to go to court to protect their religious liberties, that we are taking these steps because we are truly in an unprecedented moment. And I think that needs to be shared and known, because it's not from within this state that those challenges are coming, it's coming from without. And to your earlier point of consistency in drive-ins, we had an issue with a flower show down in South Jersey where people had spent a lot of money to put together a huge tulip farm, and they wanted to convert it from an in-person to a drive-through. The same way where we were afraid that one person collecting tickets could be a super spreader there and spread the virus from car to car, or somebody could get out of their car, cars could break down. We shut down the flower show the same way we told a priest that had come to us saying, I want to do a drive-in service and collect from my parishioners that way. We have one rule. We're not doing these gatherings, whether they're drive-through or in person, because we're afraid, because the virus is so potent in my state, that somebody could act as a super spreader, or something could happen where our law enforcement officers might have to respond. I've lost 9 law enforcement officers in this state, and I have hundreds more quarantined. And so we need them healthy, and we need them to be responding to real emergencies and not trying to break up crowds of folks who should be abiding by the governor's order until our Department of Health and other professionals say it's safe.
Thank you very much for that. Lots of great questions to both of you. Here's one for you, General Fox. Jonathan Zhu asks, where do you draw the line between upholding public safety during times like these and government overreach amounting to overt violation of rights, like the Japanese example you mentioned?
Right. Well, like I said, we are an ongoing project here in America, and we often, I think, meet situations that reoccur. And so we have a body of law, obviously, in which to rely on, that we can use, hopefully, again, without going to court, if possible, to know where we stand. But I think, in my lifetime, my mother was born 102 years ago. We just celebrated her birthday. She's no longer with us, but my entire family did a nationwide Zoom birthday party. And if you've ever seen people try to sing happy birthday on Zoom with the delay, and it was not pretty, but hopefully it honored my mother. But she was born during the Spanish flu pandemic, and there really aren't that many people here, and certainly we didn't have the technology or the health care or whatever back then. So, I think that mistakes have been made. More mistakes may be made. And I think, as General Grewal mentioned, the challenge is to include as many people in the conversation and in the decision making, and to be prepared in advance if you can. There will always be those naysayers and others who really aren't looking to be constructive, if you will. But again, I think that many of us have got it right, and many of us perhaps have got it wrong in how we balanced those rights. As an example, in Montana, we have a very robust provision in our Constitution of the public's right to know and public's right to participation in our government functions. So when the government started shutting down, just like the rest of our state, the question was, how do we participate in our government? So immediately my office brought cities and towns and counties and others, officials together to prepare guidance so that we could continue to operate as a state and at local levels as well, because we did not want to violate the constitutional rights of our citizens to participate in our government and to know what our government is doing, particularly in a time of a crisis, right? So those are some of the examples of struggling for that balance. But what we did was included as many people and organizations as possible in the discussion, because as we know, to get buy-in, you have to be inclusive. And in a situation like this that is a moving target, if you will, that's very difficult to do. And so that's why it's important to have leaders who look first to participatory government, inclusion, communication, rather than those who seek to act on their own. And I think as a nation, we've done pretty well in that regard. And of course, here in Montana, I think we've done okay as well. I'll give you one other example of, and it kind of came up in some of the things that we were reading in preparing for this, the issue of denying strip clubs, so-called gentlemen's clubs, SBA PPP loans based on the sexual content of their business. Now, we know that in that case, it was a free speech case, right? And in fact, the courts decided that the SBA could not legally, under our Constitution, deny a whole category of businesses the relief from the CARES Act based on speech, essentially. We had something similar, but we didn't have to go to court to fix it. My office regulates gambling in Montana. And I learned early on that the SBA has disaster programs already in place, standard operating procedures, which deny eligibility for any business that has gambling revenues of a third or more of their total revenues. So we started working on trying to get the White House and the SBA to change that. And eventually, it took several weeks, they did change it. Now, I never raised the issue of that also being a speech argument. But again, we always have to be careful about the internal bias that can come through in a crisis like this. Very subtle things that can chip away at our constitutional rights, and particularly those that may be disadvantaged or disenfranchised. Thank goodness for organizations that stand up for people who cannot speak for themselves.
Well, that's just a great answer to Jonathan's question, and you've reminded us that it's not permissible to strike the balance between liberty and security on a content basis, but if you do it on a neutral basis, then you are on much more solid grounds. General Grewal, we have a question from Allison Fian, who says, she asks about when non-essential businesses can reopen, even though New Jersey has no plan in place to reopen. My non-essential business is a gift store, not a gun store. Legally, can I be arrested if I open my store?
So if a non-essential business is open right now in this period of emergency, it would be a violation of the governor's executive order. And under our Disaster Control Act, that violation is a disorderly persons offense punishable at a minimum of by imprisonment or jail of 6 months and also a fine. And there could be other charges as well if you're putting people in danger. I know the governor and the team, the recovery team that he's put together, is working through plans to reopen the state. There's a framework for that. We just have not seen the extended leveling off and downward trends that even the federal government had indicated would be a necessary precursor before there would be a wide-scale opening. But I was at a press conference with the governor today, and he had indicated at that press conference that these plans are in place to start loosening the restrictions on some businesses. But again, we have to be mindful that we're not favoring one or the other as we're trying to strike these balances, and we're doing so being mindful of public health and public safety as well. But for the time being, those non-essential businesses must stay closed, and violations of the executive order do carry penalties.
Thank you for that. We have a question from John Broder. What's the right legal and practical approach to address gatherings protesting the shutdown for people who are violating guidelines on masking and social distancing? General Fox.
Well, that's a great question. And early on with the first stay-at-home order that our governor issued, we were doing weekly meetings over the phone with public safety officials all across the state. And that was the very first question: who's enforcing this, right? Who's the guy, who's the person that has to go tell someone they need to go home? And if they don't, particularly if they're in large groups, who's going to arrest them? Those are difficult questions that the governor's order in Montana didn't address, and so what we did is we took a kind of a common sense approach. Education is, I think, the first order of business. Trying to convince our citizens the importance of social distancing, the importance of staying at home if they can, and if they're a non-essential business, closing. So that was the approach that we took universally across the state with our law enforcement officers. I also have the Montana Highway Patrol, which is our state patrol, is under my jurisdiction. We actually started reducing the number of stops initially for things that were not going to hurt anyone, that were minor situations. And in the same vein, we had a gathering at our state capitol of literally hundreds of people, many of which who were not social distancing. And the local police took the position that we will just watch to make sure that that nothing gets out of hand, but they were not going to arrest anyone in that situation. And we've not had anything really since of that size. So again, what works for Montana may not work for New Jersey by virtue of the number of people, the spread of the virus, the close quarters, the condensed quarters. And so that's why I appreciated that the federal government's approach was to give all of the states a lot of discretion and latitude in how to deal with things in their jurisdiction. And I believe that's the way that each state ought to do it as well. As I mentioned, we've got over 20 counties that haven't reported a case. So, but again, this could get out of hand. The experts say that there probably be at least one more wave, if not two. And so, this is uncharted territory. I think erring on the side of caution without violating the constitutional rights of our citizens is certainly the way to go.
Thank you for that. Susan Connolly asks, Attorney General Grewal, thanks for participating in this discussion today. What issue keeps you awake at night as AG regarding COVID? I'm from Hudson County, New Jersey, originally, and my mom still lives in my hometown of WNY. I have many friends in Bergen County.
Oh, I mean, what keeps me up at night? I guess it's just the question, are we doing everything we can right now in this moment to keep our residents safe, to keep our law enforcement officers safe, to keep all the people in my Department of Law and Public Safety that I'm responsible for, 7,700 people in this department. Am I doing everything possible to make sure that they're safe right now? While we're trying to deal with the external threats that the virus was posing, one of my first priorities was to figure out a plan to get all of the public servants that work in the department to a work from home environment. How could we do that so we could continue to serve the public while maintaining that social distance, while protecting ourselves, while continuing to do the great work that we're doing? So I think that's it. I think it's, have I done enough today? Was there something more I could have done today to protect the residents of this state, to protect the law enforcement that I'm responsible for? Did I do enough and make enough calls or pull enough levers in that OEM function with our colonel who oversees that function to make sure we're doing everything possible to get enough personal protective equipment, masking, gowns to our folks? Are we finding that right balance? I think there's absolutely no playbook for this pandemic. None. We are making it up as we go. And that after action that General Fox talked about, when we look back, could we have done things differently? Sure. Could we have done more? Sure. But I think it's incumbent on each of us to make the best decision in the moment and to figure out how, after this, we could have done better. And so I think it's just that constant, have I done enough today to protect everyone I'm responsible for, including the 9 million residents of this state?
Thank you so much for that. And General Fox, the same question to you, because it's such an important one. What keeps you up at night, and is there anything that you wish that you could have done differently?
Absolutely. We've had 90,000 people apply for unemployment insurance in our state. We're estimating about a $400 million deficit and better than $2 billion in personal income dropping this year in Montana. Now, those numbers are probably dwarfed by New Jersey's numbers in comparison, but per capita, this is something that is going to take a long time to address. And I'm term limited as Attorney General, and I hope there's a future in public service for me. I'm actually running for office, but what worries me is the human factor. And as General Grewal so eloquently stated, am I doing enough? And in many respects, I feel like there are things that I just don't have the power to do that I wish I could do. And of course, there's my family and friends. Those are the ones that you most hear about that are suffering or stressed or worried. The number of calls that have come into our mental health hotlines here in Montana have gone through the roof. And so I worry about the fragility of our healthcare system in our state and their ability to withstand, particularly in rural Montana, this entire epidemic, particularly with the fact that, while they were treating people who perhaps had viruses, they also couldn't do elective surgeries and things and that they had to stop. And the number of healthcare providers that are not only at risk because they're on the front lines, but those that have lost their jobs as well and have been dislocated. And as General Grewal mentioned, because we have the Highway Patrol, and in Montana I'm also considered to be the top cop, I worry a lot about our first responders. Not just law enforcement, but detention officers, fire professionals and volunteers, EMTs, you name it. And many of those, unfortunately, as you've read in the news, have lost their lives because they contracted the virus. Those are the real heroes of this story. And those are the folks, when we get through this, and we will, we need to make sure that they know and understand just how much we appreciate what they do and what they did for us.
Well said. Thank you for those inspiring words. I think they're good ones on which to end. I'm so grateful to both of you, General Tim Fox and General Gurbir Grewal, for providing a model for nonpartisan, thoughtful discussion about the very difficult issues that are confronting us in the age of the virus, and the fact that our shared commitment to the rule of law and the Constitution will get us through. I'm so looking forward to our future collaborations, and also to welcoming both of you to the Constitution Center in person as soon as possible. Friends who've been watching, thank you for educating yourself about the Constitution and spending another evening digging into these hard issues. Once again, General Tim Fox, General Gurbir Grewal, thank you very much, and good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe, guys.
Thanks, General.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.